طيب مشان ما نتاخر رح نبدا، ممكن نطلب من الكل يقربوا لقدام مشان تكونوا يعني قدام صار فاضي وعم شوف قدام من ورا عم بدهم يسالوا اسئله وما عم نشوفهم. Can we please move forward a little bit? طب يشرفني أعرف عن بروفيسور جالي من جامعة ماساتشوستس ومدير ميديا إديوكيشن فاونديشن اللي بتنتج أفلام وثائقيات عن الإعلام بشتى المواضيع، ومن ضمنها الفيلم اللي حنعرضه يوم الخميس The Occupation of the American Mind اللي بيحكي عن طريقة تحكم اللوبي الصهيوني والعلاقات العامة الإسرائيلية بالإعلام الأمريكي. ورح يعطينا صارت محاضرتين، محاضرة اليوم محاضرة بكرة. هيدي ثاني مرة بيجي على بيروت، ثاني مرة بيجي على MDLAB، ومحاضرته من أغنى المحاضرات اللي حضرها أنا صراحة، وعنده أبحاث هائلة بهيدا الموضوع، فبتركه هو يعرف أكثر عن حاله وعن شغله إذا ممكن نرحب فيه.
I presume Jad said all nice things about me. It's nice to be here. Actually, I'm really glad to be here. The last time I spoke here in 2014, the institute was at AUB, and I thought I was going there this morning. I just checked very late, so I'm glad I made it to the right university. I know I've been told by a number of people that you're a very lively group with lots of questions. If you could hold your questions till the end, I'll make sure there's some time at the end, and you can always catch me. I'm around for the next 3 days, so you can always get me when I'm standing around if you have other questions. I want to start off with some general comments first before I get to the main part of the talk. I've seen a couple of the other presentations of the live streaming, and they go up very quickly on the web. And I've seen the presentations by Paul and by Moses, and I'll try not to duplicate those. But I also want to situate myself in relationship to them, because again, as Paul laid out, there are different perspectives on media literacy and media education. And there's no doubt that I am that the position I have hold is very specific within that spectrum. You've also been here for a while now, so presentations are most probably melding into each other by now. And so I'll try and be lively and provocative, so you may remember things. I'm going to try and make it memorable because I think we are in a very dire situation in which we desperately need to have clear thinking. Because without clear thinking, there is no such thing as effective action. And before we can start to think about being activists, we have to really understand the situation. And that's what I hope that we can start today. The Media Education Foundation that Jad mentioned, that makes films, has often been described as being in the protectionist camp. I actually don't like the way the field is divided up. I don't particularly like that phrase, but if I had to put myself in any phrase, that would be it. I actually don't think you could be in media education and be in any other perspective. Not in a way that actually matters. And I'll tell you why, because I think we are under relentless attack. When the population of, especially the advanced Western consumer societies, is under relentless pressure, relentless propaganda pressure for the entire waking hours, if you do not fight back, there's never been a propaganda campaign in history like the one that we are faced with right now. And then there's a propaganda campaign with very specific ends in mind. That's to do with us and our activities. If we do not fight back, then you'll be a victim. And that's what I try to do in my research and teaching. And actually I take seriously Chomsky's admonition. This is what he says, and I think that's his really good advice. He says, citizens of the democratic societies should undertake a course of intellectual self-defense to protect themselves from manipulation and control and to lay the basis for meaningful democracy. So self-protection that comes through intellectual understanding is, I think, what the aim of. Actually, I'm starting off with all the things I don't like. I actually don't particularly like the phrase media literacy. Because I think that when you say media literacy, it draws you too much towards the message. What is there in the message? And I think much more important is what is not there in the message. What is absent? What is structurally absent? What are those discourses, what are those ideas that we never have to engage with, that we never have to think about? That's where real power lies. And I think the focus on literacy takes us too close to the message, what is in there, what's there, rather than what is not there, rather than the absences. And so the term that I prefer is the term media education, that I think pushes us towards questions of structure and towards questions of power. So that's a general kind of way to introduce the kind of work that I do and what I'm hoping to present to you today. The presentation I'm going to give is actually a relatively, for me, a new presentation. I'm still kind of working this stuff out. I'm trying to come to terms with digital technology and how it's changed the field, how it's changed the nature of media literacy, or how it's changed the nature of media education. And I know a lot of people are interested, I already have some comments coming in, a lot of people are interested in the notion of addiction. And I'll get to that. I want to actually set the groundwork before I get to the notion of addiction. So when it comes to the understanding of digital technology, I think there are some basic questions that when I first started trying to understand the field, I do ask some very basic questions. The first question is, if it is new, if digital technology, digital media, social media, if it is new, and I say if it is new, because I think that's a question we have to ask. If it's new, how is it new? Is the newness fundamental? That is it on the surface, or is it something, deep? Or is it something that's on the surface? In fact, the same thing is happening that's been happening for a while, except it's taking a slightly different form. So we have to understand that about digital technology. If it's new, how is it new? If it's the same, how is it the same? Given that it looks so different. And I think that's actually what is confusing, that it looks so different. And social media, especially the ability that individuals have to be able to participate, makes it look so different that it must be different. Well, it may be. But I think we should pose that question, is it a fundamental difference? Thirdly, at what theoretical level do we need to think the idea of novelty of digital media? And again, what I'm getting at here is, there is a long history of media and the introduction of media forms and media technologies, going from writing to the printing press, to newspapers, to television, and the digital technology is the latest in that. How does it fit within that frame, that historical frame? And then lastly, this is something that I'm interested in as a teacher, and I think a lot of you will be interested in this as well if you're teachers, is do we need new teaching new pedagogical strategies to deal with this situation, whatever it may be. Okay, so I framed that those are the questions that I think we should keep in mind as we think about digital technology. Don't just assume it's new and fundamental and therefore totally different. But if it is, how is it? To ask those specific questions, and that will force us to deal with different theoretical literatures. Now, my own attempts to think these questions through have actually been influenced. They're influenced by my own related concerns, and they've sent me back to a book, to a 30-year-old book. And what people get interested in and what they get drawn in is very particular. I can tell you, you're going to watch a film in 2 days' time called The Occupation of the American Mind, and the narrator of the film is Roger Waters, who is, with Pink Floyd. I actually think Roger Waters' greatest album is a solo album called Amused to Death. And Amused to Death, which came out in 1994, was based on a book. Wasn't based on a book, was inspired by a book written by Neil Postman. And so it actually took me back to that book. When I was listening to the album again, and it was the issues that Postman talked about. The book was it was published, it seems ancient, doesn't it? 1985? Most probably before some of you were born in this room. But what I've started to now realize is how contemporary it is. And you've got the quote, the handout sheet. You've got a relatively long quote to start off with. This is actually the entire forward of the book written by Neil Postman. And this is the way he phrased it. And here he says he's comparing George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. He's comparing 1984 and Brave New World. That's how he starts off. And and I'm going to read this, and I'll read through it, and you can read it as you go along as well. Just think how contemporary the description is that Huxley gives. Orwell as well, but we're used to thinking about issues of surveillance and control. Those are predominant issues. We're not used to thinking about the issues that Huxley brought up. So I'm going to read this in its entirety. You can follow along. He starts off by saying, we were keeping our eye on 1984. Remember, the book is written in 1985. Okay, we were keeping our eye on 1984. When the year came and the prophecy didn't, thoughtful Americans sang softly in praise of themselves. The roots of liberal democracy had held. Wherever else the terror had happened, we at least had not been visited by the Orwellian nightmare. I shall stop there. If it only said, if instead of the book being 1984, it being 2004 or 2014, Orwell would have been absolutely right. In fact, he would have underplayed things. Postman goes on to say, but we had forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision, there was another, slightly older, slightly well less known, equally chilling, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Contrary to common belief, even among the educated, Huxley and Orwell did not prophesy the same thing. Orwell warns that we will be overcome by an externally imposed oppression. But in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, but there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal humble party. That's the terms within the book, Brave New World. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny, quote, fail to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. And this is, Postman says, this book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. And this talk that I'm going to give today is about the possibility, actually in the contemporary digital age, that both Orwell and Huxley were right. On the one hand, okay, on the case for Orwell, it's easy to make the case for Orwell. Surveillance on the internet and the network and the surveillance of digital communication is, Moses talked about it last week. I mean, this is a conversation that we are at least having now. The two kinds of surveillance. One is government surveillance. We know how effective it has been and how much complicity there is, even by companies like Google, who claim to hate government, will go along with almost every request the government makes of it. Governments like China, in China, have taken this to new lengths. And then there's also corporate surveillance. We are being watched in a way that no human population has ever been watched in history, not only by governments, but by people who essentially want to sell us things. I'll come back to that later on. Every single keystroke on a computer is captured by someone somewhere. Orwell could not have dreamed of this possibility. I have no doubt that what I've just said is most probably being live tweeted somewhere, then retweeted, and to live forever in some corner of the internet. Now, on the one hand, these technologies of surveillance have perhaps progressed too much. There is now so much information that there's no one can look at all of it, and so they've now developed machines to look at to do the surveillance through things like keywords, etc. So I'm not sure how effective that is. Actually, but we know that monitoring is happening by machines right now, and that the machines are going to get smarter in the future. With every search, with every online purchase, our profile is being altered. Actually, with robotic bots who also click on things, it's also machines are watching. Some machines are watching machines watching something. It really is a, I was going to say it's an Orwellian world. It's actually, it's not even, it's a world beyond that. With short-circuit cameras spreading far and wide in Europe, the surveillance situation is much more intense than the United States. Privacy is being destroyed. And this situation is celebrated by many people, that this is what's going to make us safe. With cell phones in our hands, and with YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and whatever else will come down the road tomorrow, at our disposal, the entire population actually is in the business of surveillance and in the business of self-surveillance. Now, there are good and bad sides to this. Again, I don't want to. I'm going to ring an alarm, but this is not a simple technology. In the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement would not exist without the internet and without these devices. The Black Lives Matter movement would not exist without video cameras capturing police brutality and then being able to distribute it. So there are positive sides to this. There is also, negative sides to this, where people's lives are being destroyed. I'll give you one example. One of the ex-graduate students from my university, University of Massachusetts, her name is Melissa Click. She was involved in a protest down in Missouri, the University of Missouri. You might have heard about this. It became an international story, in which she was caught saying something to journalists. 10 seconds of her life, in which she was trying to protect some student protesters from journalism. And this, you must probably have heard her, right? Her name is Melissa Click. 10 seconds and her life was destroyed. She was fired from her job just as she was getting tenure. So there are good and bad sides to this. So as you evaluate it, it's not a matter of black and white, of good and bad, but of shades of gray. And the shades of gray are not, we don't look at them in individual cases. When I start looking at this, how do we evaluate the structure that we have, that we are caught up within right now? How do we examine those institutions that we are caught up in? Okay, that's the case for Orwell. Relatively easy case to make, and lots of people have made it. Edward Snowden, with his release, has perhaps made the most. I'll come back to Snowden, because what's always struck me about what Snowden did is how little people cared. How little difference it made what Snowden did when you revealed to us the level of surveillance that was going on. And that's then got to do with our own adaptation into these technologies of surveillance, and how they are not out there, but they become part of us. So let me now make the case for Huxley, and this now gets us to the nature that gets us to the question of addiction. Now, this is what Postman said. It's in that quote I gave you. He says, but in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy mature in history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. There are many people talking about this. The best book I've read on it, actually I haven't read a huge amount, I'm just starting my research on this. And this is the way I always start the research when I'm going to do a new film, is who are the interesting authors talking about various things. And one of the most interesting books I've read, I was reading it actually on the plane over, is this. It's called Irresistible, and the author is Adam Alter. I highly recommend the book. I've actually got copies of it here. I'm not gonna. If you want to look at it during the break, I'll put it in a place where you can do it. So I'm gonna do something I normally don't do now. I'm gonna play you about a 10-minute clip. This is Adam Alter, actually, because I read the book, and I found a clip of Adam Alter on the internet, and I was going to summarize it, and I thought, why am I summarizing it? I'm just going to play Adam Alter talking about it. So this is him talking now. This is Adam Alter talking about the main findings of his book when it comes to issues of addiction.
And to all of you for taking some time out of your nights, I appreciate it. We all have a lot of tweeting and emailing to do, so it's very kind of you. So I became interested in this topic about 3 or 4 years ago, and a friend emailed me and said, you have to look at this game. And I downloaded the game, and it's called Flappy Bird. Has anyone played Flappy Bird? A few groans. So Flappy Bird, it's a very, very simple game. It's a game for the iPhone, and what happens is you're a bird and you have to fly through obstacles. It's really simple, and the mechanics of the game are very simple as well. You tap the screen, and when you tap, the bird rises, and when you stop tapping, the bird falls. And you have to navigate obstacles. It's actually a very difficult game to play, but what's interesting about it is that almost everyone who plays for much longer than they intend. They develop an inability to stop playing. Now, the game for a long time was a very minor game in the gaming world. Not many people downloaded it. It didn't do very well in the US. No one's really sure why, but eventually it really took off. And at the end of 2014, there were a lot of downloads, and advertisers took notice. So the developer is an indie game developer from Vietnam, and he had no real presence in the United States at the time, but the advertising revenue was such that he started to earn about $500,000 a week in ad revenue. So he was doing pretty well for himself for a little while. And the reason why these advertisers were so interested was because people spent so much time playing the game. They couldn't take their eyes off the game. So people started to post really fascinating reviews. Now, I found that I couldn't stop playing, so I was kind of curious about this. So I started to read some of the reviews, and I want to read one to you. They're sort of fascinating because they are studies in contradiction. So this person has a 5-star review. So they obviously love the game. They're trying to communicate something pretty positive about it. But the title of the review is "The Death of Me." So, and this is the content of the review. Let me start by saying, do not download Flappy Bird. I started off saying this should be fun. People warned me, but I didn't care. I played it once and said, just one more time, but that one more time never ended. I don't sleep, I don't eat, I've lost some friends because of Flappy Bird. So it's pretty dramatic. It might be overblown, it might not quite be true, but there are a lot of reviews just like it. And when people post those reviews, the like count skyrockets. So this is a phenomenon. This isn't just me and a couple of other people. There are a lot of people who played this game and felt that way. What was really interesting about this was the developer, Dong Nguyen, the guy from Vietnam who developed it, felt so bad about this that he decided to remove it from the market. So he's earning $500,000 a week, which is sort of the holy grail for an independent game developer. And he posts a couple of tweets. And this is on February 8th, 2015. He says, "I'm sorry, Flappy Bird users. Tomorrow I will take down Facebook. I can't, Facebook. Take down Flappy Bird. FB has two meanings. Flappy Bird, I can't take this anymore." And as he does that, he gets just a flood of angry people saying, how can you do this? You know, he's the dealer removing the drug from the market, and people are freaking out about it. So he says, please don't ask me, I don't sell this myself, I can't help you. So they're basically coming to the dealer and saying, look, you've got to have a stash on the side. Help me out here. And he says, no, I can't do it. And then the next tweet he posts, a couple of days later, he says, I'm working on a new game now that's designed not to be so engaging. That's how guilty the guy feels, which is a weird thing for a game developer to say. And he was right, because his next game wasn't so engaging. So he achieved that. Now, I became really curious about whether this was sort of an isolated phenomenon. Was it just one game that happened to be this way? And it turns out that's not the case. There are a lot of tech giants who have similar experiences with their own products, which I found really fascinating. So I started to do a bit of research, and the first thing I found was an interesting quote by Steve Jobs. So Jobs released the iPad in 2010 at an Apple event, and he basically spoke about how wonderful the device was. This was a tricky time for the iPad and for Apple because he released the device, people made fun of the name, they thought it was just a giant iPhone, so basically a less portable version of the iPhone. So they said a lot of really negative things about it for a while. It turned out to be a brilliant idea. It sold very well. People love their iPads. And at this event, Jobs said things like, this is the best way to consume all sorts of media. You can consume educational media, you can browse the web, you can play games, you can watch films, you can do basically whatever you like on this device. So he's talking about the virtues of the device in public. What was really interesting was about a year later, just before he died actually, he was interviewed by Nick Bilton, a tech journalist at the New York Times. And Bilton said to him, your kids must love the iPad. And Jobs said, they've never used one, we don't allow it in the home. Which is a fascinating disjunction between what he was doing publicly and what he was doing privately. Now, he's not the only tech giant who said something like that or did something like that. There's a school in the Bay Area called the Waldorf School of the Peninsula. And Waldorf schools basically have a policy that they won't introduce tech until very late on. So there are no iPhones, no iPads, no PCs, no laptops, which is unusual for a private school, but these schools have that policy. They introduce them around 8th grade, and then they introduce them in what's known as a slow tech approach. So what you do when you first encounter an iPad at the Waldorf school is you learn how to construct it, how to design apps, things like that. You're not consuming media on the iPad just for the sake of consuming media on the iPad. So the interesting thing about this school is that 75% of the students have parents who are tech execs in Silicon Valley. which again is this strange situation where parents are saying, I work for this company, this is a product that I stand behind publicly, but my kids shouldn't have access to it during the day at school, which is really interesting, I think. Now, the Waldorf School isn't the only other example. There are some others. Chris Anderson, who was an editor of Wired for about 10 years, Wired magazine, he's a tech giant himself. He has 5 kids, and he has said that he won't allow his kids access to various forms of tech. His kids have called him and his wife fascists. They're very upset about it. And he said in an interview, I know the dangers of tech firsthand. I've seen what tech can do. I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but he said that, and so he won't let his kids near these devices, which I think is quite fascinating. Christopher Mims, a journalist of the Wall Street Journal, also a tech journalist, said, when I stopped allowing my kids to use tech, they became happier, more engaged. Their imaginations were rekindled after lying dormant for a long time. Again, really interesting. Farhad Manjoo at the New York Times talked about Twitter just after the election. He was really fascinated by how many of his friends just couldn't stop checking Twitter. Over and over again, they'd return to Donald Trump's account and to other people's accounts as well, just to see what the latest thing was. And to him, this seemed a lot like an addiction. And he said in this article, what was striking was how many people, unprompted, floated the idea that their use was some kind of addiction. I'm not just talking about social media and phones here, I'm talking about games as well, as with Flappy Bird. I interviewed a guy who's he's a professor of games at the New York University Game Center. He's a brilliant guy. He has a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford. He's a really deep thinker. He's designed a number of cult indie games himself. He's made a lot of money that way as well. That's where most of his income comes from. So he's very immersed in the gaming world. And I interviewed him and I said, have you played pretty much everything there is to play? It was a sort of throwaway question just as we were finishing up. I've been speaking to him for 2 hours. And he said to me, I've played pretty much everything except one game. And I said, which one? And he said, World of Warcraft. Now, World of Warcraft, in his own description, is the single most culturally significant game there is. So I said to him, how can you be a teacher of games and not play that one game? And he said to me, half of the people who've ever played that game, and that's 50 million people he's talking about, have developed at least a temporary inability to stop playing the game. So he said to me, my concern is that I know myself reasonably well. I get hooked on the worst games out there. If this game is the ultimate vehicle for addiction and for an inability to resist, he is going to be receptive. And he said, I know that I just can't afford to lose that much time. It's not something I'm willing to do. So he won't even load up the game. There's just a gap in his syllabus where he won't talk about the game. So, you know, this is, to me, fascinating. These are idle examples here and there of experts who talk this way. So I dug further, and that's where this became more than just an article, and where I think it became a book for me, was in learning that when people did research, the results suggested that en masse, all of us are struggling with these things, or many of us are struggling with these things. So one study that I found pretty alarming was that about 5,000 young people, young adults, were asked the question, you have a choice. You can have a broken bone in your hand or a broken phone. Which one would you prefer? And the first interesting thing is that they don't answer immediately. So you watch them, and they're sort of like this, well, there are pros here and there are cons there. Even if they took a while but then said, no, come on, obviously the right answer is a broken phone. Half of them, 50%, just under 50%, 48% say, I would prefer to have a broken bone in my hand than a broken phone, as long as the broken bone in my hand doesn't prevent me from using the phone. And they're sort of kidding, but it's not just wit, it's true that it matters to them. They want to recover and at least have the comfort while they're recovering of these phones. More interesting data, I dug a little bit deeper because I was curious, how long are we spending with these devices that we can't stop using them? And I spoke to a guy who lives in Pittsburgh who felt that he and his wife weren't spending enough time together. He realized his phone had come between them. So he designed an app called Moment, which was designed to keep him in the moment. And the way it did that was it monitored how long he spent on his phone and how many times he unlocked it during the day. And he asked a whole lot of friends in the testing phase to download the app and to guess how long they were spending on their phones. And on average, they said between 45 and 60 minutes. And then he gave them the app, and the average among his friends was 3 hours. And then he released it to the world, and he found that from thousands and thousands of data points, which he shared with me actually, the average is 2 hours and 48 minutes. And there are outliers, and they happen to all be in my MBA class, because all my students, for whatever reason, are between like 6 and 10 hours a day. That's how long people are spending on phones. Now, there aren't that many hours of the day when we're awake. So 3 hours is a pretty big chunk of time when we could be doing other, more productive things.
Okay, get the lights back on, please. So you can find his talk, it's on, Google it on the internet with Adam Malta. He gives a talk at Politics and Prose in New York, giving the main outlines of his, or the main findings of his book. 3 hours a day just on the phone. That's the average, 3 hours a day just on the phone. You know, some of these other things, you know, where young people would, 50% of young people would rather have a broken bone in their hand than a broken phone. 48%, okay. I mean, that's serious levels of dependence. So the first question that comes up, and I haven't done enough, the first question is why? Right, why? I mean, if we were talking about drug addiction, we were talking about any other kind of addiction, where people are doing too much of something they can't stop, that is having a deleterious effect on the rest of their lives, and, you know, people would go into treatment for it. And the first question you ask is why? And normally what you find with addictions, you know, whether it's drug addiction or alcohol, what addictions deal with is something else that's going on in people's lives. Right? The addiction is not about the alcohol, the addiction is not about the drug. The addiction is about what else is going on in their life that the drug allows them to deal with, allows them to at least function. So that'll be the first question I would pose when we talk about this, when we talk about the level of use that's going on, is why? Because there is a reason. These are not just the tech. The way to not talk about this is to talk about the technology having some kind of spell on us. I go, if the only thing you could get on your cell phone was religious sermons, there wouldn't be addiction to your cell phone. Right? It's not the technology, it's the connection between the technology and the content that's there. So we have to then poses the question, okay, what's in the content? What's in the content? What's not just in the content, what is the content supposed to do? And of course the worrying question, or actually the worrying conclusion is of course that the content is designed to addict us. That's actually its function. Why is it designed to addict us? It's designed to addict us so our eyeballs can be sold to advertisers. That's where the billions of dollars comes from that Facebook and Google, etc., YouTube get. But the addiction, I'm calling it addiction, he calls it behavioral addiction. There's a whole technical way of talking about it, is not accidental. It is actually tied in to the forms of organization of the technology. That's the kind of worrying conclusion on this. I mean, I've seen the evidence with my own students. You must have already seen it with your own friends as well. The inability for students, for young people, to sit through a class without access to phones. Actually, I would say the ability not just of students, I'm just looking around this room. The ability of almost everyone, or groups to not be able to pay attention for an hour. Pay attention for an hour. That is high levels of something that's going on. I mean, it's not just students, it's also my colleagues. I mean, I don't want to phrase it in a generational way. I haven't been at a faculty meeting in the last 4 years when people haven't had their cell phones out in front and their laptops on front, and while someone is blaring on about something boring, they're checking their email or they're doing Facebook or something else. I don't think this is just generational. There is something else. That's going on here. And of course, and it'd be one thing if people were distracted by profoundly important messages about the world. They have to find out what's going on in Syria now. They have to find out what's happening with the refugees in Europe and in Greece. They have to find most of what people actually interact with is the most inane details of their own interpersonal lives. That's actually what most of that interference is. I think this is pedagogically. I think this is, I'm dealing from my own very particular perspective as a university teacher and the level of what's happening with teaching. This is the biggest pedagogical problem that we now have to face, is distracted students in our classes who refuse to engage. And when I say engage, I mean engage. Not pay attention on the side, engage with an idea. Think about it deeply. Stop and think about it. That is becoming more and more difficult. I'll tell you actually, I'm teaching a new class in a few weeks' time, and after I've done a little research, it'll be interesting to see how many people end up in the class, because I'm actually going to ban all computers from the class. Not just because I don't want people to have access to Facebook, but in fact they found that when people take notes on computers, because that's what people say, I'm not on Facebook in your class, I'm taking notes, right? That when actually, and they may do, but when people take notes, what they do is they transcribe. They don't think. Writing forces you to think, writing forces a choice. Whereas when you're just on your computer, you're just transcribing, therefore you're not thinking. So as I said, I'll be interested to see my experiment in a few weeks' time when I tell them that on the first day of the class. What is all this doing to our brains? Right? There's a literature on this. There is what I call there's literature called the celebrants, people who think this is a great thing, and then there are also the skeptics, people who think there are some major issues with this. And I'll focus on the skeptics for the moment. Nicholas Carr. This is a book written by Nicholas Carr, who is a columnist at the New York Times, called The Shallows. Actually, you can see it's what the internet is doing to our brains, and you can barely see. Essentially, it's a metaphorical thing. It's emptying out our brains. The blue is is emptying out our brains. And perhaps he's given the clearest eloquent expression for this. This is Neil Postman for the modern age. He says, so I think this is quote number 2. Yes, quote number 2. He says, this is Nicholas Carr says, Patricia Greenfield concluded that every medium develops some cognitive skills at the expense of others. Our growing use of the net and other screen-based technologies has led to the widespread and sophisticated development of visual spatial skills. We can, for example, rotate objects in our minds better than we used to be able to. But our new strengths in visual spatial intelligence go hand in hand with the weakening of our capacities for the kind of deep processing that underpins mindful knowledge acquisition, inductive analysis, critical thinking, imagination, and reflection. That's why it's called shallow. It's making our thinking shallower. We haven't stopped thinking, it's just making it shallower. Neil Postman would very much liked Nicholas Carr's championing of the book. He says, in the quiet spaces opened up by the prolonged, undistracted reading of a book, people made their own associations, drew their own inferences and analogies, fostered their own ideas. They thought deeply as they read deeply. I think this is a little bit romanticized about books, but it's another way of thinking about thinking, another way of thinking about engagement. Similarly, some people such as Shahid Nick Mohammed argues that rather than make us more knowledgeable, that's the celebrants, right? We've never had as much knowledge, access to as much knowledge as we have now. And superficially we don't, there's never a question you can't answer. Because you can always Google it, you can do it, you can ask the most inane question and have an answer for it in 10 seconds. Actually stop dinner conversation when there's always an answer to a problem. It's actually, it stops interesting conversations being had. But he says the internet works, instead of advancing knowledge, he says the internet works to promote ignorance masquerading as knowledge. Mark Ballard calls this the dumbest generation. He says the young people, the heart of the internet generation, constitute, quote, the dumbest generation, shockingly ignorant of civics, history, geography, science, literature, dwelling in a world of puerile banter and coarse images that are actively cut off from world realities like no other generation. Like he says, I did an article, it's a long time ago, it was during the first Gulf War. We did an article, we did a survey that showed the more people watched American network news, the less they knew about the world. Literally, the less they knew about the facts of the world, the more they watched. And a lot of people, as I've noted, including Adam Malta, have said, noted what seems to be the addictive nature of some of this behavior. Again, just going back to Postman, he says, as Huxley remarked in Brave New World, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny, quote, failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. Actually, one of the other things that, one of the other pieces of research that Adam Malta reports, he says that someone did this experiment where they got a group of people and they gave them a mild electric shock, unpleasant electric shock. And then they said, actually, could you just wait here for a minute? We have to wait here for about half an hour before the next one. And so there's a group of people in this room, and they said, and the machine that delivered the shock was in the room. They left the machine in the room. And as the researchers went out and said, yeah, if you want to, you can use the machine if you want. And what they found was that almost every single person in that room went over to the machine at some point and gave themselves a shock. The thought of being with themselves, with their own thoughts for half an hour. One person apparently was there for 10 minutes, just constantly shocking, because there had to be some distraction. Some distraction. There's a lot of romanticized talk about self-empowerment in terms of what the internet has made possible. We can now, there's a lot of talk about selfies as self-empowerment. We can now represent ourselves to the world. Actually, it's a very, you may notice that the Adam Malta clip, there was a book in the background called The Happiness Effect. And that book actually is about selfies and about the presentation, especially of young women, of themselves on their Facebook accounts and on this and how much they perform, how much they actually Photoshop themselves in terms of how they present themselves to the world. They actually have plastic surgery to make their appearance better so they can photograph better, so they can. That's how important this has become for many people. The uses of the internet, as I said, it's an interesting, the romanticized notion. We have access to the entire world at our fingertips, access to the entire knowledge of the world at our fingertips. Most of the uses of the internet, as we know, are for sex and for shopping. The top 10 websites in terms of traffic are all run by giant corporations. There is very little that's new in terms of the content that we actually engage ourselves with. Chris Hedges, he's written a fantastic book. Chris Hedges is in the United States, is one of the major political commentators that I rely upon. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Empire of Illusion. And that was the American empire being taken up by the politics of illusion. And he says, this is the next quote. This is quote number 5. It says, the triviality of American popular culture, its emptiness and gossip, accelerates this destruction of critical thought. It expands the void, the mindlessness that makes the magic, mythology, and irrationality of the Christian right palatable. Television, the movement's primary medium, allows viewers to preoccupy themselves with context-free information. The homogenized empty chatter on the airwaves, the banal amusement and cliches, the bizarre doublespeak endlessly repeated on cable news channels and the huge spectacles in sports stadiums have replaced America's political, social, and moral life, indeed replaced community itself. Although he's talking about television, he could just as easily be referring to our new digital culture. That's a pretty good, in one sense, if you want the modern case for Huxley, read The Empire of Illusion. The case for Huxley connected to the rise of the political right. The case for Huxley connected with the rise of, with the election of Donald Trump. Again, Trump didn't come out of nowhere. Trump came out of something very specific. His pandering to white supremacy, that's been going on for a long, long time. A long, long time. Perhaps Obama was the only interruption in that. But remember, Trump is, I mean, we like to think of Trump as an idiot. Have you just got rid of Trump? No. Trump is an indication of something else that's there in the culture. So how do we evaluate the internet? How do we start to think about it? Well, for this, I've gone back to I've actually gone back to what I think is one of the main political economists of media. I'm not too sure if he was mentioned last week. His name is Robert McChesney, and he's written a book called Digital Disconnect, which essentially is a Marxist analysis of the internet. It's an analysis of the internet from the viewpoint of economics, not from the viewpoint of ideology, but from the viewpoint of economics. And we're actually just finishing a film with Bob McChesney called Digital Disconnect on these issues. He says, this is the next quote, "The first thing you want to do when you look at a communication technology as profound as the internet," and he said this in a talk that we filmed, "the first thing you want to do when you look at a communication technology as profound as the internet is to get a sense of where it fits into the broad panorama of communication technological revolutions. I mean, is it similar to radio or television? And in many respects, the real debate we're going to be having, and we can't answer yet, is whether the digital revolution, the internet, is going to stack up to the truly monumental shifts of communication technology in the course of human development. The printing press, the most recent one 500 years ago. Before that, the origins of writing several thousand years ago. And really go back to the big kahuna of them all, the development of speech and language roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago. The reason why these three are considered sort of transformative communication revolutions is that they were so profound, they changed human beings. They really changed us as people. Not just our societies, but in many ways the way our brains work, and had an immense impact on the force of society. So the question with the internet, are we dealing with something of that substantial of development? Is this technology that profound? Again, actually, I don't think we can answer that question yet. I don't think we actually know enough yet about the impact that it's having. It could do. I mean, we know that, and scientists have actually said that human beings have had so much impact on the world now that we live in a new geological era called the Anthropocene. So we are capable of making huge changes, whether it's to the world or to the way our brains work. So we actually don't know that. At one level, of course, the internet just does not just arrive. In an important sense, the internet is the culmination of nearly 2 decades of electronic development and communication. From the telegraph, photography, telephony, and recording to cinema, television, and finally satellites and computers. And finally now, it seems that the digital technology has transformed and colonized everything. When that has happened, the question of how we make sense of it, and I really don't think, even though we are immersed in this, I don't think we have even started to think about the nature of the transformations that or the nature of the environment that we are in. We haven't, why haven't we thought about it? We haven't asked the questions. If you don't ask a question, it's unlikely you're going to come up with an answer that's going to say anything. You've got to ask these questions, and these are very, very profound questions. The writers who've looked at this, people such as, I said there have been some writers, people you can call the celebrants who think it's great, and people who are skeptics who think perhaps other things are not so great. According to McChesney, he says, yeah, this is a good start, but essentially the entire discussion so far has been abstracted from the concrete reality, has been abstracted from the context. And the context of the development of digital technology, it's an old word, is capitalism. How does it fit? What is the role that capitalism as a system has had on the development of these digital communications? And briefly, essentially, McChesney, I really recommend the book called Digital Disconnect. It shows that the internet, far from changing the basic characteristics of capitalism. Remember when we first started, the internet was going to revolutionize, we're going to have democracy like never else. We're going to have a population that knows more than any population has ever known. We're going to have enlightenment spread. Right? That was the... Well, the question is, what is the reality? And McChesney says, the reality is that the internet has simply made everything much worse. The internet has made inequality much worse. The internet has made monopoly much, he's looking at economic issues, made monopoly much worse. It's increased commercialization. In the United States, it has transformed politics. It's transformed politics. The old, the notion of the old, two parties and talking about relevant things, but that's gone. That notion of politics is now gone. The internet and digital technology and digital communication has totally changed it. And what it's given us? It's given us Donald Trump. Not as an accident, but as a logical consequence of that. Far from a revolutionary tool, it has turned out to be the most reactionary tool, at least in the specific conjuncture of the United States. Now, I know what you're thinking. There's no doubt that in some places, digital technologies are wonderful. Right? And this is not about the technologies themselves. This is about the organization of them. And in some contexts, the technologies, in fact, do amazing things. Like all technologies, they can be put to different uses. But the way in which inequality has risen, the way in which especially monopoly has become so powerful. The most powerful monopolistic firms in the world, among the top 5, are Facebook and Google. The term monopoly doesn't even kind of make sense to them anymore because they control so much. They control so much of the market. It's no accident. This is another book that I read, which I also bought with me, and I'll make it available to you. It's by, again, we highly recommend it. It's called by Jonathan Taplin, called Move Fast and Break Things. And what he talks about is a very concrete analysis about the internet, and essentially about how the libertarians, and they're not the libertarians, took over and changed the original formulation of the internet. When the internet was first developed, it was actually developed so it was supposed to be non-commercial, communal, etc. And it has been transformed by these libertarians who have hijacked the original intent of the creators of the internet. And these are, when you talk about libertarians, these are vicious libertarians, really vicious libertarians, who don't believe in democracy, they don't believe in caring, they don't believe in compassion, they don't believe in community, they believe in one thing: private profit. They are not anti-government. They love government as long as it increases their profits. The people he's talking about, and so the book is really good. The book, the very specific people he's talking about are people like Peter Thiel, who founded PayPal, and then was the first major contributor, first major investor in Facebook. People like Larry Page, who is CEO at Google, and people like Jeff Bezos, who founded and runs Amazon. These massive, massive companies. Peter Thiel, for example, first one of these, went to Stanford. He founded the Stanford Review, which is a publication there, to fight what he called political correctness and to fight feminism. His major influence was Ayn Rand, the libertarian thinker, the person who's written the gospel. The other person who's not on this list is Mark Zuckerberg, from the founder of Facebook. He's not as vicious as these people in his libertarianism, although you should remember that the first site that he started at Harvard was because he was rejected by a girl. And so he started this site where you could compare two people next to each other and say who was more attractive. And he did that as a direct reaction to being rejected by a woman. So there are deep gender issues involved in this. These are not just economic issues, these are deeply gender moral issues. But people like Peter Thiel, Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, if you haven't heard these names before, then you don't understand the internet. Because they're the ones who have constructed the architecture of the internet. They're the ones who created the context for the internet. And they are not innocent. They have a very particular political philosophy. As I said, it's a vicious libertarian philosophy. It's actually built on 2 points. The internet has been organized on 2 points. One is no taxes should be paid to government. All that economic activity on the internet, there should be very little that goes to government. Secondly, that's one, which is Amazon. Why is Amazon? Oh, have we got the... Oh, is it? Sorry. Now, the reason Amazon has become what it has is because it pays no income tax, it pays no sales tax. And therefore, all that tax which would go to public funds has become private profit. That's not an accident. That's what the libertarian philosophy is based upon. The other thing it's based upon is the piracy of copyrighted work. Is to take people's creative work made by artists, musicians, and to rip it off. That's what YouTube does. You want to post a copyrighted song on it. Every song that's ever been recorded is available on YouTube. Why? Because the writers of those songs, the creators of those songs have given permission? No. Because YouTube has said, you can put whatever you want up, and then if someone complains, yes, we'll take it down. It's changed the way you think about copyright and creative work, and it has changed the music industry. It has changed artistic work. The book that I mentioned, Jonathan Taplin, that's actually his kind of focus. He actually was a film producer, and also worked with musicians like Bob Dylan and the band. And in fact, he starts off the book with the example of the drummer of the group, the band, one of the most important bands in the history of rock music. The drummer of it, Lee Von Helm, ended penniless and broke and sick because he couldn't, as the internet came about, as the internet ripped off their work, his royalties suddenly dried up. And when he got really sick with cancer, there was no money to pay for it. And so Taplin takes this very seriously. But if you're serious about creative work, funding and making sure that there is creative work in the future, then you've got to put in place the conditions whereby creative workers can actually work, can actually do their job. And YouTube Google is the same. Put in any movie into Google, and the top sites that will come up will be pirate sites. Google will push you, will show the places you can get this, even though they are illegal. Google doesn't care about copyright. Okay, essentially, the philosophy of these people is not let's do what's right. It's the libertarian philosophy. It's the philosophy of bullies. And the philosophy is, who's going to stop us? Who's going to stop us? And let's do it, and let's see who's got the nerve to try and stop us. And has amassed these massive, massive profits. The reason that YouTube and Facebook have become these giants, there's one, I know it was mentioned in some of the other talks, but I don't think in the way it should be. Advertising. When I talk tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the content of advertising. But this is now advertising and its impact on the broader technology and on the broader media environment. Advertising is the driving organization of the internet. The biggest advertising agencies in the world, the biggest advertising companies in the world are Facebook and Google. I know they position themselves as media companies or as tech companies. They don't make any content. None. All the content that is on Facebook, all the content that is produced by someone else. Actually, Facebook is brilliant. Who is it produced by? It's produced by us. We work for free for Facebook. It's the biggest system of, you can call it wage slavery. It's actually, we can't even call it wage slavery because there's no wages. But every time you post something on Facebook, every time you put a piece of information on Facebook, that is what makes it valuable. That is what is going to be sold to advertisers. I know this quote was used by some, I actually don't know who wrote it, I should look in the book, right? But this is, if you are not the customer, you're the product. Again, there's one I always ask very simple questions. That's one that, right? When it comes to Facebook, it's worth now, what was it, $455 billion in capital in the stock market. Why? Where's this money come from? Do you pay when you open up a Facebook account? No. It gets its money entirely from advertisers. Google is the same. These are they're the biggest advertising agents, biggest companies in the world. I'll give you this, I just read this yesterday actually on the plane. This is a review of 3 books. It's in the London Review of Books. You can Google it. I'm sure it's free on Google. And it's a review of these 3 books, and actually it's a really good review because I actually learned so much because they essentially summarized everything that's in the book about how these companies work and what is driving these companies. This then pushes me to another literature. As you notice, every time new questions come up, the question, I then go to a new literature, which was the literature of the communications theory of history. It pushes me to people like an old scholar, actually I'm going to stop here. What Facebook and Google need, they need addicts. They need them. They need addicts. Addicts. They need us to not be able to stop looking at this thing, because the more we can't stop looking, the more money they make. The technologies are designed. These are not simple, they are not innocent. They are not innocent. The technologies are designed. The games, Adam Malta started off with Flappy Bird. Right? They're designed. That's the thing about human beings in the world. The world doesn't come down fully formed from heaven. Someone actually constructs it. Someone constructs it who has particular interests in mind. And those interests are to get people. You see, the first I mentioned, the first book on this is called The Attention Merchants. That's essentially been the function of media. The internet is just the latest version of this. Actually, I'm going to fast forward through a few things here. I want to come to the notion of the mode. This is my Marxism coming to the fore even more now. The notion of mode of production. So Marx's notion of history was that history is driven forward by the development of different modes of production. And the mode of production, whether it's feudalism or whether it's capitalism or what will happen with socialism later on, or whether it's slavery, that's a mode of production. It's made up of two things. On the one hand, it's made up of the means of production. What are the technologies of production? And then second, it's made up of how those technologies and how human labor is organized. It's the means and the relations of production. And Marx's theory is that as history progresses, the means and relations of production will come into conflict. That as things develop, the relations of production, the way in which something is organized, will act as a fetter, will act as a restriction on the means of production. In fact, the means of production, the technology could develop more, but it's being held back by its organization. And when that happens, there will be a revolution. Because the technology because there'll be new relations of production that are needed to make the technology, the potential of technology possible. I can't believe I just explained Marx's theory of history in a minute. Right, that's my, well, I wanted to instead think about something called a mode of communication. Rather than thinking about technology, right? Rather than thinking about digital technology as a technology, I want to insert it in a set of relationships and a set of institutions. And so a mode of communication, actually you can look at whether it is the development of writing, whether it is the development of the printing press, whether it's the development of television, whether it's the development of digital communication. Can all be seen this way. On the one hand, you have the means of communication, and then on the other is the way in which they are organized. And together they make up the mode of communication. And actually Bob McChesney is actually very powerful on this. He says, essentially, if we want a better internet, we have to get rid of capitalism. Capitalism is like holding back the development of the means of communication. If we really want to unleash the potential of the internet, the potential of these digital technologies, we have to organize them, put them into a different way. You have to stop making advertising the major thing that's driving it. There's nothing about technologies that make them this or that. There is a bias. I'm not saying that technologies are totally innocent. Okay? There is technology. Some technologies are good for some things. Some technologies are good for other things. Those are what in the field is called a bias. There's a bias towards certain things within the technology. But it only becomes active in particular situations, in particular relations. And that's why I went to the libertarians, I went to Peter Thiel, and I went to Jeff Bezos, and I went to Larry Page. They're the ones who are determining these modes of communication. That's the major pedagogical challenge, it's the major political challenge we have. is that these technologies, that's why I presented the information from out of Malta, these technologies of surveillance, control and distraction, they're actually not just out there now, they're in here. There's an old quote by Marshall McLuhan actually says, we're not too sure who discovered water, but we're pretty sure it wasn't a fish. Well, we've actually become the fish. We've become the water. The water is not out there, the water is inside us now. How do we see it when the water is actually part of how we think about ourselves? That will require a process of intense investigation. And I'm not really sure what's going to happen, to tell you the truth. I'm not too sure if my efforts are going to lead to anything. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that clear thinking will lead to. The revelations of Snowden, whenever Snowden released the revelations of the NSA and how much surveillance was going on, were met with a shrug of the shoulders. What our political leaders were really doing in WikiLeaks did not cause a crisis of state authority, as I'm sure Julian Assange thought they would do, or Edward Snowden thought they would do. The revelations of torture that were in WikiLeaks barely register. It's like a shrug of the shoulders. Oh, people are getting tortured, so what? So I'm not too sure. I'm actually not too sure. The tragedy and disaster of the refugee crisis caused by the Syrian war only registers in the most selfish terms in America. We don't want them here. It does register, but it registers through the mindset of libertarian philosophy. What's in it for me? And if there's nothing in it for me, why should I care? People are drowning by the score and by the dozens as they try and reach somewhere else. That actually is one of the most disappointing things here. I think the aim of media education, which is the project I put myself in, the aim of media education is clarity of thinking about our current situation. I think we actually have the tools to do it. I think we have the tools to actually really reach clarity about this. The tools are our old tools. We don't need new tools. Of course, new tools always develop. Intellectual tools are always developing. It shouldn't just be like we've got this instrument, right? Theory is constantly developing. But we have the tools. The tools I would think we need are the tools of political economy and cultural studies. And we have to develop them to this new situation. So I hope I've somewhat convinced you that both Orwell and Huxley, actually, and I would say Marx, were right. And we have a lot of work to do. Thank you. I think so, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. So who's first?
شكرا جزيلا على هذا العرض القيم. لا شك أن ما قلته في مجمله صحيح، ولكن ربما هناك قسوة شديدة في نقد العلاقة بين الجمهور ووسائل التواصل الاجتماعي واستخدام شبكة الإنترنت. ربما هناك قسوة ومبالغة، لأننا نجد في الجانب الآخر أن شبكة الإنترنت بمجملها وما قدمته من وسائل التواصل أسهمت إلى حد كبير في تسهيل حياة الناس. ففي الجانب الآخر نجد أن مستخدمي شبكة الإنترنت ووسائل التواصل الاجتماعي استطاعوا أن يصلوا إلى المعلومات، واستطاعوا أن يصلوا إلى الكتب الإلكترونية، واستطعنا أن نصل أيضا إلى المرحلة الأخيرة المتقدمة، وهي مرحلة إنترنت الخدمات. فإذا هناك جوانب مضيئة لشبكة الإنترنت، وهناك جوانب إيجابية عديدة لاستخدام وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي. وليست بهذه الصورة التي يمكن أن نقرأها فقط من زاوية التسطيح وانحصار الناس في الجوانب السلبية أو انحصارهم في تبادل النكات والأخبار السطحية البسيطة. شكرا.
So could someone do, this wasn't working, so I didn't get any of that. Someone try and do a quick translation? Or?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you were talking about social media, that it can be used for positive functions, and the internet as well. Sorry?
Make it easier for investors to find information to get there's also a positive side.
So it's not only a negative side for social media, but also a positive side of it that we can use and benefit from.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I thought I was trying to say that there is a positive side. It's not one way in which it can be used. Right? There is. I mean, you can talk about the start of the Arab Spring. And I mentioned Black Lives Matter. Right? There are these social movements that wouldn't be possible without the internet. And I just don't think you can. I don't think the internet is a. I think the internet is a great tool of organization. If you want to have a march tomorrow, it'll get you 10,000 people in the street. If you want to change the world the day after, with organization that's going to require, it's not going to do that. And so yes, it has, obviously it has, I said, it's an incredible technology. The question that, I guess what I would want to, well, I guess what I hope the question that people get, or that you can pose after this, is there a way in which those, in which the technology can be organized in a way in which those things are enhanced, in which those aspects become even more pronounced in the ways in which we use it? Yes, at the moment, of course there is. I would say it's a very small amount. I mean, in terms of the kind of the political usages of it, and it's on the margins. Obviously it happens, but it's on the margins. The main stuff of all the statistics I gave, in terms of the internet, even of social media, what people use it for sex and for shopping. Pornography and shopping are the main functions of the internet. Yes, these other things go on as well. And so you can't just say one is good, that everything is the same. Which is why what I wanted to say was, it's not a matter of this case and that case. Right? It's a matter of looking at the institutional structure as a whole and making judgments about that. Sorry.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and engaging lecture. It was amazing to listen to you here today. My question is, under the circumstances that we live in globally, any attempt to regulate the internet is going to be faced with a lot of opposition, not just from the big media conglomerates and the big people who control the media or control the internet, but even by citizens, because they see it as an attempt for censorship or for passing on a political agenda or even a social one, whatever that is. So from your point of view, how do we deal with this? Thank you.
I think it's to do with, the question I would say is, what's the nature of that regulation and what is it's attempting to do? What is its outcome? Well, but there's also always some reason behind it, right? I mean, in the States, the major debate that's taking place is around net neutrality, right? I mean, and that's something very specific at stake. Net neutrality is about whether you're going to have an internet that's open, or whether you're going to have an internet with different speeds going in than the people who are powerful have. And there is a battle being fought around that. So I don't think some issue of regulation. Everything is always regulated. No such thing exists outside of human regulation. The question is, what's the function of it? I can tell you, Taplin is really good at this. In the United States, what's called the regulatory structure has been totally controlled by Google. Google has so many lobbyists. They have the largest number of lobbyists in Washington. And so for all of what Google says about, about the government, I mean, essentially they're controlling. And I think that the question we have to have is about that the internet is a public resource. It's not a private resource, it's a public resource. It was developed with public money, it takes place over the public airways, it goes through the ground that's public. In that sense, it's like a public utility. It's like the water, it's like rivers, it's like, yeah. So how do we, what are the principles that are going to do to, and I think there's different things. I think that the Chinese government will want to regulate it for a different reason. So if you have an authoritarian government, they'll want to regulate it for a different reason. An authoritarian regime will want to shut it down. Right? So, but that's not to say that the regulation is what's the issue. Right? What's the question behind it? And to the extent that I think you're going to have that question, which is, this is a public resource, what is the best way to organize a public resource for the good of the public? Actually, I'm not sure this is working, so it's... Okay.
بالبداية نشكر حضرتك القيمة. سؤال في البداية جناب قلت أنه لا أميل
Or perhaps you could ask it and someone can think about translating it if they can in their heads. So go ahead.
أشكر محاضرتك القيمة. في البداية قلت لا أميل إلى تسميتها التربية الإعلامية ولكن التعليم الإعلامي. ما هو السر؟ شكرا.
Why did you call it media education and not media literacy?
I think media literacy puts you into the message and what's in the message. And I want to be outside of the message and look at all the different things that structure that message. And also, more importantly, what is there in the structure that doesn't allow something to become part of a message? What is it that, what never makes its way into being a message that we can read? And that's where power comes in. I mean, if you'd ask me what's the power I want is the power of propaganda. If I was leader of some government, like the power of propaganda is not, I don't want to control the message. Well, I can, but my control of a message is dependent on that there are not other messages also. That there is nothing countervailing that. There's nothing that's going to impact what that message does. And to do that, you've got to think about issues of censorship and issues of control outside. And so it's not, for me, it's not a strong thing. I often say I'm in the field of media literacy, but it's a preference that I have because I think it pushes you, one pushes you to a message, and the other one pushes you to structure. And my preference is structure.
I have a question also concerning digital addiction. So, as you just said that you were concerned about structure, but as an exercise, we used to do this thing where we would go without media for 2 days. So no phones, no laptops, no nothing, and we were basically studying how our withdrawal of all this media made us more anxious and more disconnected or unaware of or uninformed about what's happening around us. Perhaps what we should do as media literate people is to do this regularly and to disconnect regularly in order to do away with this heavy addiction to digital technologies and stick more to traditional or face-to-face interactions or interpersonal interactions in order to, first of all, while being aware of the structural problems or the structural constraints of digital technologies, and relating more to interpersonal interactions and valuing them more. What do you think about that?
Sure, I think I got most of that. One of the things that Adam Malta does in that talk, he says, okay, what should we do about this? And I'm not, actually, I think, I mean, in the United States, there is this thing called, turn your TV off or screen-free week for children. And I'm actually not in favor of that, because it's kind of, you can't go what they call cold turkey, because we've now become reliant upon it. And so what Walter says, and what he says is, it's an issue of being mindful. Can you, and he says one of the things that if you're mindful about it, and I think you can, I mean, I thought one of the most interesting things he said was about the people who developed this technology when Steve Jobs said, I don't let my kids use it. Right? He was making a decision for his kids about the kind of technology that they were going to be, and that's a decision that we can make. I think it has to be done not in a way that makes you out to be a fascist, as one of the other people said, but in a thoughtful way. But you have to control that. I would say we have the ability to control our own ecology of information. We don't, in one sense, it's different than pollution. We don't have the ability to say, I'm not going to breathe the air that's out there. To do that requires, we've got to change that, you've got to have large-scale social change and action. But you can say, if you're mindful, I'm going to, for 2 hours a day, I'm going to turn my phone on. I'm not even going to have it on me. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to do analog things. I'm going to do things like have conversations with people. I'm going to go into a coffee shop, I'm going to have a cup of coffee, and I'm not going to get my phone out straight away. I'm going to do something else. And I think if you're mindful in that way, that you can stop. Actually, I just did it. It's interesting. I just did it at breakfast today. Some of you may have seen me. I seem to remember some faces there. As I was reading Adam Malta and about this, and I thought, I always, when I have a meal, when I'm by myself, I'm always doing something. Like I've got to have my phone with me, I've got to have a book with me, I've got to, like I can't. And so actually today I actually just took nothing with me. And I actually just was very mindful about the meal that I was having at that time. It wasn't easy. It was like, because you have to get used to it. But it's that mindfulness. And then the question is, that's personally. But Alter also gives the example that some businesses have also got policies, for example, around email. If you go on vacation, one of the things that's always, when you go on vacation, right, it's like, you're going to come back to 1,000 emails. And that's stressful. That means when you're away, you're never away. And so one of these, I think it's BMW, I think in Germany. None of these companies are American companies, all these things are happening in places. I think BMW in Germany, but if you go on vacation, there's an automatic message that comes up to whoever's written to you, saying this message will be deleted immediately, but this issue is being dealt with by someone else, and we'll give the email of someone else in the company who is dealing with that issue, but the email will go. And so when you come back, you've got the same emails in your box as you left. And therefore you're not thinking, you don't have that anxiety, and you're not also thinking, well, I'm missing something, because if it's important enough, that email will go to someone else. So organizations can also do this. Or if you're mindful about it, institutions, organizations can also do something about it. So individually, I think it's actually quite easy to come up with these. One of the other examples he gives is, I think it's in Germany again, is he says at 5 o'clock, people are working, I think it's a design firm, at 5 o'clock, everything, people stop, and the desks they're working on rise to the ceiling. And it turns into a yoga studio, or it turns into a dance studio. So literally, come 5 o'clock, you cannot work. And that's mindfulness at the level of employers. I think you can do mindfulness at the level of individuals. The question is, can you do mindfulness at the, and this is what I mean, I'm hopeful, you know, that the debate that's taking place in the United States around net neutrality is, I don't know where it's going to end up, but I'm really happy the debate is taking place because it's making clear that this actually is a socially contestable area. This is a political area that we need to contest. So I'm not sure if that got to your question.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I really enjoyed listening. You mentioned that the vicious libertarians ruined the internet, and you named them because they believe in private profit, and namely you said they were the Peter from Facebook and Larry from Google, and I'm only going with the first name, and Jeff from Amazon. In your opinion, how could they have done it differently? What could they have done to, you know, could they have thought of the like Marx about the good for all the people? How could that have been done so that the internet wouldn't have been so bad and so vicious?
Yeah, so again, the Jonathan Taplin book, which I would recommend to you, which I'll leave here, he says actually the origins of the internet, the people who developed it, had very different philosophies. And so it could have gone in a very different direction. And so if you wanted to stress other things, you could have had, you know, government intervention in this to protect it from private resources. But it never became, that issue of that this is something that's public, never became an issue. And if it had been, then you would have a debate about how do we want to use it. So if we'd have treated it, is it too late? I don't know. I think we're still very early on. It's not like, you know, this has been going on for centuries. We could still have that. Yeah, yeah. And but they're actually within traditional media. They're actually in the United. You know, there is public broadcast media in Europe. There's supposed to be something in the States, and that this debate does take place. That you're using the public airwaves and you're using public resources, and therefore it needs to be organized for the public good. That debate never happened.
Why don't we start such a debate? You're living in the States and you're a researcher and you know so much about the topic. It's our responsibility to make the change.
I agree. I think the first part of that is education and is getting people to understand. And I think that's why the net neutrality debate is the start of it. That's what that is. That net neutrality is the start of that debate that says there is something more at stake here than the interests of Google and Amazon and these other large companies. That there are, that if you want to, I think if you could get Jonathan Taplin and say, look, you want to support. I actually think it's a very easy argument to make. You want to support. You want music tomorrow. You want good creative music tomorrow. You have to pay for it now. And in one sense, young people these days, especially, and it's not just young people, but no one wants to pay for anything. They think that creative work just, that you can get it from YouTube. And again, a discussion that says, actually, that song that's on YouTube that you just downloaded took the labor of this many people, took this much effort, and if you want them to do it again, then you've got to pay for it. And it's to make that valuable. And the question you're asking is why can't this? I think it can be done, and I think the start of it is to think about it in a different way, and to start and think clearly about it in a different way. iTunes, yeah, that's one, but that's.
This is between legal copyright and piracy, and I think piracy exists with or without digital media. You can get pirated DVDs from like black market shops.
Well, so the question is about, but the piracy, for example, on YouTube was made possible by the Digital Millennium Communication Act signed in 1996 by President Clinton, that wrote into law a particular version of this copyright that said, yes, you have copyright protection, but you have to, if your copyright is violated, you have to complain, rather than the other way around. So again, it didn't come out of nowhere. That came out of government action that changed the nature of copyright. Could you change it again? Could you have, if Congress was to pass laws about copyright that said that whenever YouTube put up a copyrighted video, a copyrighted song, it was in violation and it was going to cost them $1 million every time they did it? You would change the nature of piracy on YouTube. That, if you had that kind of regulation around it. So it is, there are, you can do it. I mean, yes, the people who are making money on YouTube, on iTunes. Yeah, we're not talking about the Katy Perrys of the world, right? The Katy Perrys of the world and the big stars, they will make their money, right? But but creativity is not just that. I mean, that's the commercial level. How do we want to fund and how do we want to support commercial, how do you want a creative activity at other levels as well? How do we want to put money, do we want to put public funds into supporting creative work at that level? Actually, I'm a big fan, in the United States, most of the investment of money into the cultural industries goes to things like opera and ballet and middle class. And I'd be really in favor of actually having a public fund. Sorry, I keep going back to Jonathan Taplin. How do you do it? You tax advertising. You have a 2% tax on all advertising. At the moment, advertising is tax exempt. At the moment, if you're a company, you advertise, you don't pay any tax on that. There's an incentive for you to advertise more. If you were to introduce an advertising tax of 2%, make it 1%. You would generate revenue in the billions of dollars. $500 billion you could get. And you could target that to a fund that's going to support creative work. So now you have public investment in creative work that's not about making money. I'm not the expert on this, right? There are ways of doing this, that are doable. The question is political will. In the United States, if you try to tax advertising, you would have Google, Amazon, every single major company, including all the advertising companies, because they make their money by the fact that it's non-taxable. It's the one thing you can't, you could change almost everything else in the United States. It's the one thing you can't change. If you could, it would open up resources to be able to fund different things. So I think the issue is the lack of political will, not the lack of our imaginations as to how to do this.
Thank you, Saad, for this amazing lecture. We look forward to your lecture tomorrow about advertising. Maybe you can talk more about this last point that you just mentioned, which is really important. Okay, thank you all. ساعة وقت الغداء. بس بعد الغداء الفاكولتي حيجتمعوا معنا بإيربن for 1 hour. حيكون معنا lecture صغيرة مع دكتور منى نبهاني. And then رح ننتقل بعد هذه المحاضرة على